Lonely Cowboy sent for a mail-order bride until a woman twice his size stepped off the train and called him husband. Montana, 1,187 Great Northern Railway Station early afternoon. The breeze rushed in from the peaks, bearing grit and a sense of eager waiting. Abe Hartley positioned himself rigidly on the timber deck, his hat clutched in his fingers, his footwear coated in grime from the 3-hour journey to the settlement. He fiddled with the neckline of his faded plaid shirt and gazed intently along the rails, his pulse pounding against his chest like a caged sparrow. He was 36, slight in build and reserved in demeanor, the sort of fellow who allowed steeds to nibble from his palm, yet struggled to meet an unfamiliar gaze. Ever since his junior sibling had perished in a livestock theft 2 years prior, Abe had dwelled in solitude on his spread close to the foot of the Elkhorn Mountains. No callers, no relatives, only the heavens and quietude until this moment. A month earlier, he'd dispatched a note to a marriage advertisement in the Regional Gazette, portraying himself as a diligent laborer in search of a mild-mannered lady, ideally one fond of preparing meals and meadow blooms. He hadn't anticipated a response, but one arrived in tidy script. With a touch of blossoming elegance from a woman named Flora May, she wrote of sunsets and quiet dinners, of her fondness for bird song and pie baking. Her words painted her as soft-spoken, maybe even dainty. Abe had read the letter at least 20 times by firelight, imagining her with delicate fingers and a sweet voice, perhaps with a ribbon in her hair. The whistle of the train shattered the silence. The Great Northern hissed to a stop, brakes screeching against iron. Abe straightened, palms suddenly damp. Passengers descended. Merchants, a preacher, children chasing each other. Then she appeared. Flora May. She stepped down from the last car, boots thewing onto the platform like thunder. Tall, nearly 6'ft", and broad through the shoulders. She wore a wide-brimmed straw hat and a long green dress that clung to her powerful frame. In one hand, she carried a large leather trunk as if it weighed nothing. Abe blinked, certain he'd misread the name tag. But then she caught his eye, smiled gently, and said loud enough for the onlookers to hear, "You must be Abe Hartley." "Hello, husband." A chuckle rippled through the small crowd gathered to see the mail-order bride arrive. Old Mr. Kellogg leaned in to whisper something to his wife. A girl pointed wide-eyed until her mother yanked her arm down. Abe opened his mouth, closed it. Flora stood in front of him now, closer than he'd imagined anyone being today. Her eyes were green, steady, and kind. Her hand extended, broad and strong, but held with surprising care. He took it. Her grip was warm and firm, not crushing, but commanding. "Train ride." "All right," Hamanaged, voice dry. Flora tilted her head. "Bit bumpy through the butt hills, but I suppose life always is." He had no idea how to respond to that. They stood in awkward silence while the conductor unloaded her second trunk, equally massive. Abe couldn't help but notice how none of the men offered to help. "I've got it," she said, hoisting the second trunk with her other hand. "Of course," Abe muttered, heart sinking. He had expected someone who'd need protection. Someone soft, small. Flora wasn't small, and she sure as hell didn't need protecting. They walked toward the buckboard wagon tied outside the station. Abe kept glancing sideways as if trying to match this towering woman beside him with the one in the letters. She noticed. "I suppose I look different than you expected?" she said, not unkindly. Abe scratched the back of his neck. "You could say that." Flora laughed, not mockingly, but like someone genuinely amused. "Same goes for you," she said. "I imagined a man with more chin." That made Abe look at her. Truly look. And for a second, the nervous knot in his chest loosened. They reached the wagon. Flora stowed both trunks with a strength that made the wooden boards creak. Abe climbed into the driver's seat, struggling to keep his boots from slipping off the edge. She sat beside him, hands resting calmly in her lap, looking out across the open fields. Neither spoke as the wagon turned toward the mountains. The townsfolk stared after them, whispers rising like dust in the wind. And in the silence, Abe Hartley realized his world had just shifted, and he was not sure whether to feel grateful or terrified. The wagon creaked to a stop as the sun slipped behind the hills. Abe climbed down first, then offered a hesitant hand. Flora ignored it politely and stepped down on her own, boots crunching against gravel. They stood before a small wooden cabin nestled at the base of a ridge, smoke curling faintly from the crooked chimney. The house looked like it had been built for a man who expected no visitors and wanted none. The roof dipped slightly in the middle. The front porch slanted. A single rocking chair sat off to one side, its paint peeled by wind and weather. Abe cleared his throat. "It's not much, but it's dry." Flora stepped inside, ducking slightly under the low frame. Her shoulders brushed both sides of the doorway. The interior was as humble as expected. Wood walls, a narrow cot in the corner, a table with one chair, a rusted stove, and a single shelf holding a few dog-eared books. The ceiling was low enough that Flora had to tilt her head to avoid brushing the beams. Still, she said nothing, just walked the room slowly, taking in every detail with quiet grace. Abe scratched the back of his neck. This place wasn't built for company. Flora turned, smiled faintly. Neither was I. There was no ceremony to it, no kiss, no welcome feast, just silence. Abe showed her where the basin was, handed her a tin cup, and muttered something about "feed in the horses." Then he disappeared into the dark. Flora stood alone in the center of the tiny cabin. Her trunks remained by the door. She sat gingerly on the lone chair. It creaked dangerously. She stood again. Instead, she knelt beside one trunk, retrieved her journal, and began to write by lantern light. "First night, house smells of pine sap and gun oil. He's smaller than I imagined. Seems scareful, like a man waiting for the wind to turn. And dangerous. I won't push, but I'll hold my ground." The next morning, she attempted to make breakfast. The stove was too small. Her elbows kept knocking spice jars off the shelf. And twice, she smacked her head against the ceiling beam. The second time, she let out a bark of laughter that echoed through the cabin. The food, flapjacks and eggs, came out passable, though slightly burnt. Abe sat stiffly at the table, chewing quietly. "You don't have to cook," he mumbled between bites. "I usually eat jerky." "Well, I'm not jerky," Flora said simply. He didn't respond. By midday, Abe had saddled his horse and rode out to the fields. Flora stayed behind, sweeping the porch, folding linens, organizing the shelf. She found a small tin box labeled letters. Inside were a few pages in neat handwriting. His brother's, perhaps. She didn't read them. Instead, she spent the afternoon planting flower seeds, mariold and lavender, in a narrow strip by the window. Then she sat on the edge of the porch and began writing again. That evening, when Abe returned, they ate in near silence. Flora asked if there were coyotes nearby. Abe grunted. She asked if the well water was safe. He nodded. It wasn't unkindness. It was awkwardness. Like two strangers who had been forced to skip the parts where strangers become friends. The next morning, Flora stepped onto the porch to find something unexpected. Beside the old rocking chair was a new one, taller, sturdier, made of raw pine slats, clearly hastily built but strong. The wood was still raw, edges unpolished. A few nails stuck out slightly crooked. Flora stared. She reached out, ran her fingers along the armrest. The height was perfect, the seat broad and firm. It didn't creak when she Saturday. She looked out toward the barn where Abe was stacking hay back-turned. A small smile touched her lips. "Not much of a talker," she murmured. "But at least he's observant." She sat back, the morning sun warming her face, and let herself imagine just for a moment that this odd little house might become something more than shelter. It might become home. It started with shouting. Abe had just returned from the creek with a pail of water when he heard the noise, panicked voices, children crying, a dog barking frantically in the distance. Then came the name, "Thunder's Loose." Abe dropped the pail water sloshed over his boots as he ran. Across the dusty field, a commotion was unfolding near Mrs. Hemphill's garden, the notoriously fussy widow who had spent the past 3 years building the only flower bed in 5 Mi. And now that flower bed was being systematically demolished by a 2000 lb Black Angus bull with horns like sides. Thunder, his prized stud bull. The animal snorted, hooves stomping at rows of petunias like they were rival beasts. His tail flicked like a whip, eyes wide, white foam at the corners of his mouth. Several men from neighboring farms had arrived, ropes in hand, trying to corner him. "Get behind him. Don't spook him." But Thunder did not like to be told what to do. With Abelo, he lowered his head and charged. 2 men leapt out of the way. One wasn't fast enough. He was tossed over the fence like a rag doll, landing with a groan. Abe froze on the edge of the scene, jaw clenched. He had raised Thunder since he was a calf, but the bull had grown wilder with each passing year. No one could get near him now, especially not when he was worked up. "Move!" someone yelled. "He'll kill someone." Then another voice broke through the noise. "I'll handle it," Flora said, heads turned. She was striding across the field in her long skirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, boots caked in dust. She moved with eerie calm as if approaching a stray kitten instead of a raging bull. "Flora, don't." Abe called after her. "He's dangerous." But she didn't pause. Instead, she stepped over the broken section of fence, barely needing to lift her leg, walked slowly into the trampled garden, and began to hum, low and steady, a tune not meant for anyone but the creature before her. Thunder snorted, pawed at the dirt, nostrils flaring. Flora raised one hand. "Hey now, boy," she murmured, her voice deep, steady, almost motherly. "That's enough showing off. Let's settle you here." The bull took a step toward her. Gasps rose from the crowd. Abby's heart nearly stopped, but Flora didn't flinch. She kept humming. Thunder came closer. Then, shockingly, he lowered his head, nudged her thigh like a dog, asking for scraps. She reached out and laid her hand on his massive neck, fingers sliding through bristled hair. "There we go," she whispered as if they were alone in a quiet barn. Slowly, she pulled the length of rope from her pocket, looped it around Thunder's thick neck, and gave a gentle tug. "Come on then, let's go home." The bull obeyed. Not a word, not a snort, just turned and followed her across the field like a repentant child. Silence rippled through the crowd like thunder after lightning. Mrs. Hemphill's mouth was frozen open. The two men who'd been tossed aside leaned against each other, dumbfounded. Abe stood perfectly still, chest rising and falling like he'd been holding his breath the entire time. Flora didn't look at anyone. Shelled Thunder back across the fence line, tied him to a post near the barn, and brushed the dust from her hands. Then finally she looked toward Abe and said, "I think the west fence needs reinforcing." Then she turned and walked into the house. Abe didn't follow her right away. He stared at the bull, still panting but calm. Then at the crowd, still stunned. Then at the ruined garden, and finally at the place Flora had just vanished into his house. Her house now. He exhaled slowly and muttered under his breath, "Well, I'll be damned." The stars were slow to show that evening, as if even they were hesitant to intrude. The day's dust had settled into a quiet hush. Crickets sang somewhere in the tall grass, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and honeysuckle. Abe sat on the front step of the porch, elbows resting on his knees, hat in hand. Flora joined him without asking. No words passed between them for a long while. They just Saturday side by side, like two people unsure if the silence between them was friend or stranger. Finally, Abe spoke. I'm sorry," he said, voice low, "for disappointing you." Flora didn't look at him, just stared at the horizon. The outline of the mountains cut sharp against the fading light. "You haven't disappointed me," she said. He turned to her, surprised. She went on softly. "You just didn't know what you were asking for." Abe winced. But she wasn't angry. "I read your letter 100 times. Flora said, her voice wrapped in memory. "You wanted someone kind, gentle, who loved nature." "I meant all that," he said quickly. She smiled faintly. "But you probably pictured someone smaller, quieter, someone you could lift with one arm." A pause. "I've been told," she added dryly, "that I'm the kind of woman you only invite to weddings if there's a barn that needs raising." Abe let out a breath. It was half a laugh, half a sigh. "I didn't picture anything," he said finally. "Not really. Just someone who wouldn't leave." Silence again. He looked down at the hat in his hands. "My brother Elijah, he was younger than me, bigger too. Strong, brave as hell. He could rope a steer faster than anyone in 3 counties. He was the kind of man people looked at and said, 'Now there's someone who will build something that lasts.'" Flora turned toward him, watching quietly. Abby's hands clenched slightly around the brim of his hat. "One night we heard something near the east pasture, thought it was coyotes, turned out to be rustlers, armed. They spooked the herd and tried to take half of it." He swallowed. "Elijah went after them. I told him to wait, but he never waited. They shot him in the back." His voice cracked. "I hid behind a hay bale, couldn't move. Couldn't fire a single shot, and by the time I did, it was too late. Flora didn't speak. I've felt small ever since, he said. Like, if I can't protect the people I love, maybe I shouldn't have anyone to love. A gust of wind stirred the dust at their feet. After a while, Flora said softly, I was engaged once. His name was Henry. He was a school teacher. Abe looked at her. We planned a spring wedding. I got fitted for a dress. And then his mother met me. She laughed bitter and light. She said, Your hips could carry a mule. What man wants to wake up beside a draft horse? Abe flinched. Henry didn't say much. Just stopped coming around. Left town by fall. Flora stared out into the night. Since then, I've always had to walk into rooms ready to be laughed at or pied or stared at like I was a puzzle someone forgot how to solve. Abe sat in stillness beside her. No apology, no denial, just his presence, solid, steady. That night, they said little else, but neither one moved away. The next morning, Flora stepped onto the porch as the sun rose and paused. A new bench sat there, sturdy, wide, made from barnwood, freshly sanded, big enough for two. No note, no explanation, just the unmistakable scent of sawdust and care. She sat down. The wood didn't creak. It held her comfortably, confidently. Abe came around from the side of the house, wiping his hands with a rag. Flora looked up at him and smiled. For the first time, she said, patting the seat beside her, a chair doesn't make me feel like I'm too much. He sat down and they stayed there side by side, letting the morning settle around them like new skin. The summer fair arrived with banners of red and gold flapping in the breeze. Main Street was crowded, the scent of kettle corn mingling with horses and fresh hay. Children darted between booths, their laughter rising above the bustle. A and Flora walked side by side down the dusty road. He wore his cleanest shirt, boots polished. She wore a blue calico dress that stretched slightly across her broad shoulders, but moved gracefully with every step. Heads turned as they passed. She married him for the land, one woman whispered behind her parasol. Bet she eats more than the cattle, snorted another. A small boy tugged at his mother's hand and pointed. Mama, why does that lady look like a man? Flora heard it all. So did Abe. He stiffened, his jaw tight, hand curling into a fist. He began. But Flora gently touched his arm. No, she said calmly, her voice like steady rain. Not today. She stepped away from him and walked toward a group of children near the hay bales, where a few were half-heartedly tossing beanbags at a crooked board. Would you all like to learn something real? She asked, crouching low, though even crouched. She towered. The children stared up at her, wide-eyed. She untied a coil of rope from around her waist and laid it on the ground. Let's see if any of you can build a proper tent. A girl with freckles and tangled braids stepped forward. I don't know how. That's all right, Flora said with a warm smile. Neither did I once, but if you've got 2 hands and a little patience, we'll figure it out soon. A dozen kids were laughing, hauling rope, driving sticks into the earth, and looping knots as Flora showed them how to make a triangle stand firm against the wind. She guided them gently, correcting without scolding, celebrating every small success. She hoisted one boy onto her shoulders so he could tie a flag at the top. A few of the parents watched from the sidelines, whispering less now, some even smiling. Miss Flora, can I try next? One child called out. I want to build the next one. Miss Flora, do you think I can be strong like you? She laughed a low, honeyed sound and nodded, stronger. From across the square, Abe watched it all. She stood there, sleeves rolled, dirt on her palms, surrounded by giggling children like a mountain wrapped in sunshine. Her eyes sparkled, cheeks flushed, and for the first time, she didn't look out of place. She looked home. Abby's hand slowly unclenched. He removed his hat and pressed it against his chest, breath catching in his throat. He had seen her. Be patient, be gentle, be calm. But this joy, this command, this sense of belonging, this was something else entirely. The same people who had whispered now watched her with hesitant admiration. As Flora walked back toward him, dusty but grinning, one child clung to her skirt and asked, Miss Flora, will you come next year too? She ruffled his hair and winked. If I'm not too busy wrestling bears. The boy giggled and ran off. Flora reached Abe, brushing dirt from her hands. Well, she said, amused, At least no one called me a horse this time. He looked at her, his eyes full. You're incredible, he said. She raised a brow. Took you long enough to see. He chuckled, looking away, eyes bright. And somewhere deep inside, something shifted, not just in Abe, but in the town itself. The rain came softly that evening, whispering on the roof like a lullaby. Inside the cabin, the fire cracked gently, casting golden shadows across the walls. Flora sat near the hearth, long hair hanging damp down her back as she combed through the knots with steady fingers. Abe sat across the room, quietly oiling a saddle strap, though his hands moved slower than usual. His eyes kept drifting to her, the way her shoulders sloped with tired grace, how her fingers worked through her hair with both strength and care. He'd never seen anyone quite like her. Flora broke the silence first. "When I was little," she said, voice soft, "I used to lie in the grass and talk to goats." Abe looked up. She gave a wry smile. Up in the Ozarks where we lived, there were not many children around, and even if there were, they did not want to play with the big girl. She mimicked the words with a mockery that did not quite mask the old wound. Too tall to be picked for dance. Too broad to wear white. Too much woman. Not enough wife. That's what the preacher's daughter once said. Abe frowned, heart twisting. Flora continued, her eyes fixed on the fire. So I stayed outside. Learned to listen to the earth. Trees don't care what size you are. Neither do animals. They just know your voice. The silence that followed was heavy but kind. Then without a word, Abe stood and disappeared into the back room. Flora didn't move. She just stared at the fire, thinking she might have said too much. When he returned, he held something small in his hand, a ring, but not gold or silver. It was made of braided wild grass, carefully woven and bound with a tiny carved bead in the center. He didn't kneel. He didn't speak right away. He just stepped close, reached for her hand, and placed the ring in her palm. "I'm not good with promises," he said, voice low and rough. "But if you stay, I'll learn." Flora looked up at him, eyes wide, mouth parted, but no words came. She didn't put the ring on. She didn't need to. She just took his hand and held it tight. That night, no vows were spoken, no kisses exchanged, just two souls sitting close to the fire, quiet, but no longer alone. The next morning, Flora woke early, the rain gone, the world washed clean. As she stepped out onto the porch, she paused. The stairs, which had always been narrow and awkward under her long stride, now had a new bottom step, wider, sturdier, made of fresh-hewn wood. She smiled. No note, no fuss, just a step and a message. Later that day, she dug her fingers into the earth near the porch and planted a row of sunflower seeds. She worked with care, spacing them perfectly, pressing each one down like a prayer. When Abe returned from the field, he watched her from a distance. She didn't look up, just kept planting. But she said clearly without turning her head, "I think the soil here's good." He blinked. "Yeah," she smiled. "I think this place might finally feel like home." And that night, under the first bloom of stars, Abe sat beside her on the porch bench, the one he'd made wide enough for two, and listened to the wind hum through the hills. For the first time, they didn't talk about the past. They just sat in the now, and that was enough. The storm rolled in with a low growl, thunder rumbling behind the mountains like distant drums. Rain lashed at the windows in sharp waves, and the wind moaned through the cracks of the old cabin. Abe was sharpening a knife by lantern light when a sound caught his ear. Not thunder, not rain. A metallic clank, then another from the barn. Heros slowly grabbed his rifle and moved to the door. The wind yanked it open with a howl. Outside, the world was drenched in shadows and mud. The rain blurred everything beyond the porch, but he saw it. A flicker of movement near the paddock. Boot prints in the muck. Nothing's not Floris. His heart dropped. Thieves again. The same kind that killed his brother. He swallowed hard and stepped into the storm. Behind him, the floor creaked. "I'm coming," Flora said simply, already pulling on her coat. "Stay inside," he snapped, not out of anger, out of terror. But she was already loading shells into her shotgun. Side by side, they crossed the yard in silence, soaked to the bone. The barn loomed like a ghost through the rain. Abe held up a hand, crouching low. The horses inside were restless, stamping and snorting. Voices muffled, then a curse. 3 men, maybe 4. He knew that voice, growly, cruel, bored. the same bastard who had laughed when they found Caleb's body twisted beneath broken beams. He had gotten away that time. Not tonight. Abe raised his rifle, hands trembling. He could not stop shaking. His brother's blood, the screams, the fire, it all came flooding back. He shut one eye, steadied his breath, finger on the trigger, but a boot snapped a branch behind them. The thieves turned, one raised his gun, and Flora moved, not with panic, with power. She threw herself in front of Abe just as the shot fired. The bullet missed, but the force of her shove knocked her backward into the haystack. Abe roared. The scream that tore from him was part pain, part rage. His fear dissolved in the storm. He fired once, twice. 2 men dropped. Another bolted through the back of the barn, straight into the arms of the sheriff's men, who had been trailing them for days. Rain poured like judgment from the sky. Abe ran to Flora, who was groaning, clutching her ribs. "You're hit!" He gasped, dropping beside her. "No!" she hissed. "Just landed hard!" He touched her face, muddy and wet and strong. "I thought," his voice cracked. "I thought I lost you." Flora gave a weak grin. "Wouldn't be the first time I took a tumble." Abe pulled her into his arms, held her tighter than he ever had anyone. And then he said, voice breaking, "You don't have to shield anyone anymore. Not me, not ever again." They sat there in the hay and rain and smoke of gunfire, surrounded by broken boards and the echo of thunder. But all Abe saw was her. She had protected him, and for the first time, he had fought back, not out of revenge, but for someone he loved. The sheriff gave the all-clear. The remaining thieves were bound and taken away. Thunder rolled off into the mountains. Later, as they limped back to the house under one shared coat, Abe whispered, "I couldn't save Caleb." Flora looked at him gently. "But you saved me." He stopped walking, took her face in both hands. "I ain't ever letting anything happen to you again." She touched his cheek. "I believe you." And in the ruins of fear, something solid began to take root. Not just survival, but love. 1 year later, the winds that once howled down from the mountains had softened. The sun rose warmer, and the soil near the Hartley homestead bloomed brighter than it ever had. The house had changed. The porch was lined with pots of sunflowers. A second bedroom had been built where the old tack room used to be. Abe had torn down half the barn, not to demolish but to rebuild. He kept the old wooden beams, the ones Caleb had carved his initials into, the ones still bearing the faint marks of youth and mischief. He sanded them smooth, stained them with care, and built a cradle. The nursery smelled of pine and old stories and hope. Outside, Flora sat on the porch, her hands resting on the gentle swell of her belly. The fabric of her dress stretched over her stomach and her cheeks glowed, kissed by both sun and expectation. She rocked slowly, eyes half closed, listening to the rustle of wind through sunflowers. "Our child," she murmured, "will grow up knowing how to love the land, the sky, and all that is different." Abe stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her shoulders. He pressed his lips to her temple and whispered, "And they'll know that love doesn't come in a mold." They stood like that for a long moment, surrounded by everything they'd rebuilt, not just walls and fences, but faith. The night the baby came, the wind returned. A storm churned in the sky as Flora gritted her teeth through the pain. It was not an easy labor. Her size made the delivery difficult, and even the midwife looked concerned. But Abe never left her side. He held her hand, whispered strength into her ear, wiped her brow with shaking fingers. "I'm here," he said again and again. "I'm right here, Flora." And when, just before dawn, a single sharp cry split the silence, it was as if the storm outside stopped to listen. A girl, strong, loud, perfect. The midwife swaddled her and handed her to Flora, who lay trembling, tears running into her hair. Abe knelt beside them, touched the baby's tiny fingers. "She's beautiful," he breathed. Flora turned her head, looked into his eyes. "We did something," she whispered. "Something they all said couldn't be done." He leaned forward, pressed his forehead to hers. "We made something that's only ours." They named her Hope because that was what they had grown here. Not just crops, not just cattle, but belief. Weeks later, Flora sat under the sunflowers, a notebook on her lap. The baby lay sleeping in her cradle nearby, shaded beneath the porch roof. Abe was in the field mending a fence. His shirt hung off one shoulder, his hat tilted low. She watched him for a while, heart full, then bent her head to write. Her first poem in years to the cowboy who never looked away. When Abe came in later, dusty and sunburnt, she handed him the page without a word. He read it once, then again, then looked up at her with tears in his eyes. "I don't deserve this," he said. "You earned it," she replied. Every line. As the sun dipped low, the three of them sat under the tall sunflower tree. Not really a tree, just the tallest of the stalks towering over the porch like a guardian. Flora took the baby's tiny hand and laid it atop Abe's calloused palm. Her own hand covered theirs both. 3 different shapes, 1 heart. And as the wind rustled the petals above, it whispered not of endings, but of beginnings. And that was the story of Flora and Abe. 2 souls who didn't fit the world's measure, but found a home in each other's hearts. In a land where storms rise and the soil is harsh, they planted something no one believed could grow. Trust, tenderness, and love that didn't need permission to exist. If you felt something stirred deep down, if this story made you smile, tear up or believe again in quiet, steadfast love. Don't forget to hit that hype button. And if you want more tales of cowboys, wild-hearted women, and frontier love that refuses to be tamed, subscribe to Legends of the Wild West stories. Because out here the dust settles, but the love never does.